As COVID-19 cases continue to rise, what are we to make of it all, especially as the mortality rate seems to be declining? Should we be as deeply concerned as some suggest? Should we be moving deeper and deeper into lockdown modes once again? Today, here on a special edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads, I'm very much looking forward to having on three doctors to talk about the current state of COVID-19, a little bit about the public policy situation, and more. You're watching Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. We're starting right now.
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome to another edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. Once again, I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, and it is such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today, as always. And folks, I appreciate your support. If you can please like and share this video, I am sure that you will find ample reason to do so. It will be informative, and it will be educational on what's really going on with COVID-19 in America right now. I will talk a little bit about it from my own personal experience, having just a few days ago gotten out of COVID quarantine after not only I, but my entire immediate family and my sister's boyfriend caught the virus. Thankfully, none of us were hospitalized. We all persevered through it, and are part of that statistic now that shows that so many people are getting through it, are surviving this virus, which, by the way, has an incredible range of symptoms. It's absolutely extraordinary. Today, here on the show, we're going to be diving in deep for a little bit into what's going on with COVID-19, the situation with the vaccines, the public policy, a variety of things that we are going to be talking about today to make sure that you're getting accurate and as complete as we can information on what's really happening right now. And to talk about this, I am so pleased to have three physicians themselves joining me here on the show. Dr. Louis Kohl is Chief Medical Information Officer, Senior Medical Director, and Chief Safety Officer at CareMount Medical. Dr. Lee Gross is the owner of Epiphany Health and president of Docs for Patient Care Foundation. And Dr. Nan Hayworth is former Congresswoman for New York's 19th Congressional District. She is, in fact, the first female doctor ever elected to serve an entire term in the United States House of Representatives, and is also a retired physician herself. All three of these doctors join me now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads with their expertise. Thank you all for coming on. I so appreciate the opportunity.
You bet, Jimmy.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I want to start off by going to Dr. Kohl. I want to talk to you for a moment about the nature of COVID-19 right now, Dr. Kohl, particularly given that we are seeing cases go up, but thankfully we have generally been seeing the mortality rate, it seems, kept in check. We are seeing some hospitalization increases in certain parts of the country. But from my experience with COVID-19, the symptoms are just absolutely varied. You have a range that goes from being asymptomatic to maybe having just sort of very mild flu-like symptoms to having maybe, like I felt, a nasty flu, congestion. I'm still getting over a little bit of the congestion, a cough, a couple of points where there were chills or basic body aches, to where you have an outright fever, could be a serious high fever, maybe even requiring medical attention. You can have oxygenation levels that get too low, could require hospitalization. You can have real strong physical body pains, but there is a real, I just found it to be a strange range, especially as my family went through it, and now a number of other people I know are currently enduring COVID-19. So Dr. Kohl, let's start with you. What is sort of the nature of this virus right now?
You know, it's an animal virus, so it jumped into humans. So really all bets are off. When a virus develops for millions of years in your species, its goal is not to kill you. Its goal is to reproduce and get to the next person because evolutionarily success is reproducing. This virus, because it jumped into humans from an animal, it's going to find its way with us. Like you said, it's been everything from completely asymptomatic, where you don't know you have it, and that's why it spread so fast, to family killers. I mean, in New York, we saw entire families wiped out. It depends on your genetics. It depends on your risk factors. New York had its early outbreak, so we are not seeing as many people hospitalized now or dying as we did. I think it burned through a lot of the vulnerable population, and hopefully people are a little bit smarter about protecting themselves right now. But like you said, this is a virus that we learn a little bit more about every day.
Yeah, and that's the thing, Dr. Gross, to Dr. Kohl's point. The thing that strikes me so much about this virus is that we knew very little about it in the beginning. Now we know much more, but it's still like you can't exactly predict, okay, this person is going to feel this way and have these particular symptoms. So what are your thoughts on where the virus is, what the nature of this virus is, and then also sort of the progression of the caseload, because we are seeing it tick up noticeably across the country?
I think that's the important thing is now we've experienced this virus for since March. And we're starting to get an understanding of the pattern of the behaviors and who really are the most vulnerable. And what we can see is that, 90+% of the deaths in the country are in the elderly. They're in the 65 plus population. So as you're looking to, sort of target who you're going to protect, that is definitely your most vulnerable populations. And as we're opening up schools across the country, we're actually seeing, kids certainly can get sick, but they just do not appear to be the super spreaders that we sort of feared. The Florida schools have been open since August, and we've just not seen, thankfully, mass outbreaks in the schools. I think that's probably in large part because of the great work the schools, the teachers have been doing in that. But, so in Florida, we're now seeing a large spike in the number of cases. I will point out that in the United States, we're now testing 1.2 million people per day in the country, 1.2 million tests per day. But, so as we hear the president saying, well, you're doing so many tests, but the percentage of positive tests coming back is also going up, which means the disease is absolutely definitely spreading. It's not just because we're testing more people, we are seeing more disease in our communities. But as you pointed out, here in Florida, we're now approaching, again, 5,000 cases per day. But the death rate in Florida has dropped to the lowest rate since July. And it continues to drop every single day. So as the numbers are rising, the death rates are in fact dropping. And the interesting thing is, as the hospitalization rates remain flat in Florida, we're still seeing drops in the deaths. And I think that's largely due to a few factors. Number one, as Dr. Kohl had mentioned, there was a vulnerable population that was hit very hard early in this process. It's affecting a younger population here, especially in Florida. We're getting better at identifying who really needs to be hospitalized and who can sort of stay home, what the risk factors are for that. And then the therapeutics are getting much better between the steroids and the remdesivir and the plasma treatments. I think that the opportunities to treat these people more aggressively, and as of just yesterday, the emergency use authorization now of outpatient therapeutics is very promising. So I think there are great opportunities moving forward.
Dr. Kohl, I would love for you to comment a little bit on what you have noticed, especially from the emergency medicine and urgent care side, about these trends in terms of the exposure to the virus, in terms of the number of infections, that is the rising positive caseload, but also the trend in hospitalizations and mortality rate, to what Dr. Gross was talking about.
Yeah, we are definitely experiencing in the New York City and Hudson Valley area of New York State, we are definitely seeing a very rapid rise in the number of people who are infected. We're also, as you said, testing many more people. We are not hospitalizing as many people as we did in March and April, and fewer people are dying. All good. We do see that those who are vulnerable have figured out they need to bunker down. We're definitely seeing it spreading very fast in the young, but a very significant portion of the cases are asymptomatic, where they say, I've just got a runny nose. I've got, no, it's my allergies, and you test them and they're positive, or just a sore throat. So we are definitely seeing that same sort of thing. But the problem is, as it spreads, you're going to nail the more vulnerable population if they're not careful. We're definitely seeing, for Halloween, people went to parties. We're seeing athletic activities where everybody is outside without a mask. People, especially when they eat, they let their guard down. They say, well, I've got to eat, and you're 2 feet away from somebody who also doesn't have a mask on. You trust them, they're your family, or they're your good friend, and then next thing you know, you're under quarantine because they were positive. But we're definitely experiencing the same thing in New York, at least in our area, of declining mortality certainly compared to what we saw in the spring, and also hospitalizations.
Yeah, I can attest, being part of a family that ended up contracting it, all of us, that you certainly may get set in certain comfort levels in particular situations that could find yourselves self-deceptive, shall we say. Dr. Nan Hayworth, I want to ask you, on your perspective, where we are at, especially based on the data that you have studied and gotten to understand, what we just heard from Drs. Kohl and Gross, but particularly also in terms of this public policy side, because some have said, the lockdowns really worked before, and so that's why some places, I think Colorado's leaning towards returning to a lockdown, unfortunately. There's the mask mandates, these other things. Do you think that some of the public policy steps that have been taken across the country have been effective? What are you noticing overall?
Well, I'm so fascinated to hear of Dr. Kohl's and Dr. Gross's experiences on the ground in practice, caring for these patients on the front lines. I sit somewhat back of that, obviously, and survey the whole landscape. And certainly if you look at the evidence, lockdowns don't seem to work, except perhaps in areas of intense urban concentration, but the overall data are such that even the World Health Organization has said that lockdowns should not be a primary tool. And one of the statistics that's of great concern is that probably now about a month ago, the Centers for Disease Control issued an analysis of all causes of death, excess deaths versus what would be expected for the course of the year during which we had this pandemic. And there were 300,000 excess deaths, of which 200,000 were attributable to COVID. But 100,000, fully a third of those deaths were not directly attributable to COVID, but were attributable to the effects of lockdowns. And that includes neglected medical care, people who did not go for care when they needed it, when they should have. It includes deaths of despair, depression, drug overdoses. It includes deferred diagnoses, and some cancers are so aggressive that we actually have had folks perish from cancers that were undiagnosed even in these few months. And reputable authorities have said that they expect that eventually the deaths from undiagnosed cancers will actually exceed those from COVID over the course of the next several years. And that's a dreadful toll. In terms of masks, if they're worn in hospital, and I can't wait to hear Dr. Kohl's and Gross's experiences with this and their opinions, but certainly the top line is that if they're worn hospital style, which the vast majority of people do not wear, meaning an N95 style mask worn in such a way that all of your breath passes in and out of the mask, nothing goes around. That's really a standard that very few people meet in their everyday lives. If you're not wearing a mask that way, the protective effect is reduced. There is probably a benefit at the margins, and that's enough, given that it's a minimal imposition, for, I think, most of us to say that it's not a big deal to ask me to wear a mask in public. But certainly, unfortunately, it's not a panacea, and it's not a guarantee. Hand washing I think has had a major beneficial effect. And hand washing and surface disinfection in terms of the transmission of infectious diseases overall, especially viruses, the flu, the various forms of common cold, which include from rhinoviruses and adenoviruses and coronaviruses that aren't the novel coronavirus, and norovirus, which is the awful GI bug. Those, I think, have all decreased in incidence because we are paying a lot more attention to that kind of hygiene.
Yeah, one thing I have noticed is that if you are lucky enough to go into a restaurant, or like I do, I often go to my local Dunkin' Donuts and go sit in the coffee shop and work on my computer for however many hours. You go into the bathroom and you do notice that there, at least especially in the high points of this virus, that people are using the soap a lot more than they ever did before. Dr. Lewis Kohl, I'd love for you to talk a little bit to what Dr. Nan Hayworth was talking about there with regard to the masks and some of the other factors. But one of the things that she hit on that I thought was just so important are the negative effects of these lockdowns, the stressful situations from people who have lost their jobs, who found themselves in at-home situations where they're stuck at home a lot more, maybe more abusive. For example, child abuse also has been going up through the roof in so many parts of the country. And now you have kids that are back in remote learning and their adverse effects long-term in terms of education. What are your thoughts on some of the steps that have been taken and their efficacies, Dr. Kohl?
So let me go to masks first, because I really do think masks work. N95s are clearly more protective than a regular surgical mask or a thick cloth mask. But even in our own practice, we see 7,000 patients a day. Very few of my staff members, docs, nurses, medical assistants, have gotten sick. And it's because we made every patient put on a mask to walk in the practice, and we make our staff put on masks, and we make them wear eye protection. This particular virus is spread mostly by droplets. Droplets are little tiny balls of spit that you create when you cough and when you talk. And you're catching a lot of these if you have a mask on your face and the person you're talking to has a mask on their face. And I don't think this is a civil rights issue. I think you don't necessarily have a right to hurt somebody else. If you don't want to wear a mask in your house, by all means, don't wear it. But if you go out and you're potentially near someone who's vulnerable and you don't know that someone's vulnerable, they can look young and healthy, but they could have bad genetics or medical problems and they could still die from this. So I really do believe in masks. I think that if everyone wore masks, we probably wouldn't need to shut down. It wouldn't be necessary or necessary in every area and circumstance. It's absolutely true, and I think the data is growing, that having everyone trapped at home and even afraid to seek medical care certainly hurt people. We know in New York City there were a significant number of excess deaths, people who literally stayed home with heart attacks because they were afraid to go to the emergency department because they'd catch COVID. So yeah, you have to have a compromise. You have to be able to seek medical care, to seek socialization with other people, to get services that you need, but you need to do it in a safe way. And to me, that's masked.
Dr. Lee Gross, what are your thoughts listening to some of what's being said here, sir?
Yeah, I think the important thing is that a one-size-fits-all approach is just not appropriate. So wearing a mask in an emergency room makes a lot more sense than wearing a mask standing by yourself out in right field of the baseball field. And I think one of the issues that we had early on is, we shut down Bonita Springs, Florida, when there was an outbreak in Manhattan. That didn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to have so if you look specifically at Florida, about 60% of reporting jurisdictions in Florida have less than 100 cases since the whole start of this thing, and about 40% of the jurisdictions have less than 10 cases in their community since the entire start. Why are we masking them? Why would we mask a community that doesn't really have disease unless there's particularly high-risk people? So, if the outbreak is in Miami, then we don't lock down Wauchula. We take appropriate precautions. We wash our hands. We protect the vulnerable, but we don't necessarily lock down the healthy. I think one of the important learning messages is that what's good for one community may not necessarily be good for all. And I understand that you have to take approaches if we want to protect that community with 10 and keep it at 10, there are certainly some steps that can be taken to do so. But again, the same approaches in every community is not necessarily appropriate.
Dr. Nan Hayworth, to Dr. Gross's point about local communities or states handling things differently, we're now seeing increasingly Joe Biden, who may be the next president of the United States, talk about a national mask mandate and expanding on a number of things from a top-down level at the federal government. And I'm curious your thoughts on that sort of approach as opposed to the more state-by-state strategy that President Trump's administration has taken.
Well, you do run into distinct constitutional issues. That's just the way this country runs, Jimmy. A president cannot declare a national mask mandate any more than a president can declare a vaccine mandate or a national lockdown. That said, states have tremendous power to take those actions on behalf of public health, and indeed have. And it has definitely varied state by state. And to Dr. Kohl's point and to Dr. Gross's point, it's incumbent upon every state and every community to be vigilant, to be meticulous, to be thoughtful, and for their citizens to be aware of what their vulnerabilities may be and what they can do and what they can accept in their own lives as measures to try to reduce the impact of this virus. All of that said, it's very important for us to recognize that fortunately, very fortunately, the survival rate for this virus overall in the United States population is greater than 99%. To my very good friend and colleague, Dr. Kohl's point, however, he is right. We can't predict necessarily. We can figure out who's most vulnerable, but we can't necessarily predict who among the walking healthy may be struck down by this virus and have a terrible experience. Fortunately, though, as Dr. Gross pointed out, therapeutics are now speeding to market ever more efficiently and effectively. And we just had a new antibody, an intravenous antibody preparation that Lilly has created. It imitates the body's response to the virus. We all remember President Trump talked about receiving Regeneron, which is actually their antibody cocktail, REGN-CoV-2, and SARS-CoV-2, I think it's called. And that contain the antibodies that your body would ordinarily generate, but you don't have to wait to get sick to have the benefit of those antibodies. That's a tremendous therapeutic advance. That's going to become widely available at scale, I'm sure, very quickly. Regeneron is ready to produce their antibodies at scale. When they get their emergency use authorization, we have remdesivir, we have dexamethasone, we have procedures that we know will help people in the worst case scenarios. And all of those things together mean that we can feel more at ease about a given state opening up relatively more than perhaps some other state does. Florida is more open than New York, and Florida seems to have fared quite well, all things considered, in this crisis.
Again, we're talking with Dr. Nan Hayworth, former Congresswoman for the 19th Congressional District in New York, Dr. Louis Kohl, Chief Medical Information Officer, Senior Medical Director, and Chief Safety Officer at CareMount Medical in the state of New York. By the way, I'm originally from upstate New York, so you've got three original New Yorkers here on this program today. And then also Dr. Lee S. Gross, owner of Epiphany Health and president of Docs for Patient Care Foundation. He is in Florida. Just a few minutes left with the three of you, and I so appreciate the time. Dr. Kohl, I would love for you to please speak to what Dr. Hayworth was saying as far as some of the therapeutics. What are you noticing has been working? I know, for example, that I have seen lately in the past 3 weeks, I know more people, including myself, who've contracted COVID-19 than I had at any point, maybe even combining all the previous months. So I can definitely attest that positive cases are going up. But everybody I know, but for one person, who has just in the past few weeks contracted this virus, thank God, has not been hospitalized. The friend of mine who has been hospitalized is currently or just wrapped up a remdesivir treatment. So that's certainly one that we know a lot of folks, including President Trump, have gotten as part of their treatment. So Dr. Kohl, what have you noticed have been working in that regard, and what's your take on the prospect for a vaccine such as the one that Pfizer seems to be close to finalizing potentially, or at least is showing real progress?
So I think the first big step was definitely Decadron, which is an old drug, and it definitely seems to have reduced the number of folks who progress to going on ventilators and even die. The folks that we talked to in the ICUs around the city, many of them were using steroids before it became acknowledged that they were beneficial, because they were trying anything when in March we were seeing patients dropping like flies. So the steroids made a big impact on people not progressing to death and intubation. Remdesivir is helpful. It certainly is not like taking an antibiotic for strep. You take the antibiotic and you get better, but it is mildly effective and probably also prevents progression. The antibodies that Dr. Hayworth mentioned by Lilly and Regeneron, we are hopeful that those will be very effective. They're going to be expensive, and they can potentially have side effects. Anytime you take an antibody like that, your body can have a severe, what's called an anaphylactic reaction. Hopefully you won't with these, but not that many people have tried them yet. I think the expense and availability are going to be the bigger issues early on, but it's phenomenal to see them get to market so fast. I have very high hopes for the vaccines. My guess is we'll probably have 3 approved vaccines at least by January, maybe sooner. They've all in the early trials shown effectiveness in terms of getting your body to make an immune response. How long that response will last, we don't know yet. And we obviously don't have long-term safety data. We want to get as much safety data as we can, but probably the best way for us to get out of this is to get people vaccinated.
Dr. Lee Gross, what are you noticing as far as treatment, sir?
Yeah, so I just actually want to piggyback on what Dr. Kohl said really about vaccines, because I think that's a really critical point. Yeah, so we lost almost 300 children in 2018 to influenza, and we have a vaccine for that. 80% of the children that died that year did not take the flu vaccine. And so polling in the United States now around potential COVID vaccines said that about 70% of Americans are skeptical of the vaccine and will not take it. Only 30% in the public opinion polls say that they trust the vaccine. I want people to keep an open mind about this vaccine, because we are not rushing the science of the vaccine. What we are doing is rushing the infrastructure developments around distribution of this vaccine. We're creating vials, sterile vials. We're getting vaccine distribution plans. That is all part of the Operation Warp Speed. But the scientists that are developing these vaccines are largely staying out of the politics, and we really appreciate that. And I think these vaccines will come out. They will be safe. They will be effective. And I do think it is the solution to this problem for the American public.
Yeah, and Dr. Kohl, because I know if Doctors Hayworth and Gross can stick around a few extra minutes, that'd be great, but I know you have to run, sir. So I'm curious your thoughts on the polling data that Dr. Gross just pointed to as far as vaccinations. I know myself, I want to wait a little bit. I mean, I just had it. But I want to wait a little bit before I get the vaccine, because I've looked at the history of vaccine development and noticed that this seems the fastest vaccine ever created. Now, I understand that medical science has improved, and I'm not saying I won't take the vaccine. I'm saying I want to wait a little bit to kind of get a little comfortable and see how it is. What do you make of that? What do you say to somebody like me who's not saying I'm not going to take the vaccine, but I want to wait a little bit and see how it impacts average people?
You know, I think if I had COVID, I'd probably wait a little bit longer, because you're going to get some level of natural immunity, but we don't know how long that will last. I think that people should be comforted that, as Dr. Gross said, I think the scientists are really taking the lead on this, and this is not going to be a political decision, and these vaccines are not going to be available until there's adequate safety data. As you said, these vaccines were developed incredibly fast, but we took advantage of some recent breakthroughs that were made in large part for finding an Ebola vaccine, which they worked on for years. They just transferred that tech over to COVID, so we got very lucky. But people are going to be skeptical. It depends on how fast you want to get the country up and running and returning to normal. But you're going to need to see lots of people getting the vaccine before everyone feels safe. But, it kills us to see children dying every year, the way Dr. Gross said, because we have effective, safe vaccines, and people read on the internet that you shouldn't take vaccines because it's going to hurt you or make you autistic. There's just no data for that. It's criminal that so many people die every year. 30, 40,000 every year from flu.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And usually I get the flu shot. I just haven't yet. I will very soon, though. I don't want to get sick again. Dr. Kohl, before we let you go, anything more you want to add to the conversation?
I think that people are really letting their guard down. If you might be young and healthy, or you're just not afraid of getting this virus, and you might do just fine if you get it. But you have to think of who you might give it to. If you're going to go to a Thanksgiving celebration and you hug grandma, you might not see her again in 2 weeks. That there are still people who are incredibly vulnerable to this and can still die. So just don't let your guard down. I do believe in masks, as I said. Do believe in physical separation. I think we can get by without locking the world down again. But I think masks would help us, and vaccines will certainly help. But if you don't let your guard down, if you're not careless about big celebrations and being very close to people, like Dr. Gross said, if you're standing in right field by yourself and there's nobody within 100 feet of you, you don't need a mask. But if there's someone within 2 feet of you, you do need a mask. So I think people just have to be smart and protect themselves and not let their guard down. And thank you. I do need to run. Thank you very much for the entertaining conversation. Be well, all. Peace.
Fantastic insights, Dr. Louis Kohl. Really appreciate you taking the time, sir. Thank you. Dr. Nan Hayworth, I would be curious, and if I could steal a few minutes more of your time, Dr. Hayworth and Dr. Gross, I'm curious your thoughts on the vaccine debate right now, because it does seem absolutely promising. And by the way, I'm not meaning to express any sort of discouragement of others. I'm just a little bit of a wait-and-see kind of guy when I'm seeing something that usually takes years to develop suddenly come out to the market.
Right. Well, Jimmy, it's entirely understandable. And, unfortunately, there's been a lot of, there's never been, we haven't experienced a pandemic like this, any of us in our lifetimes, obviously, and it's been highly politicized. And I mention that not to emphasize politics, but it's certainly crept into attitudes about vaccines. And we have had prominent folks on one side of the aisle who have expressed skepticism and there were governors of blue states who have said that they will not allow a vaccine to come to market in their states until they have independently evaluated it. What they think they have that the FDA does not eludes me. And so that just smacks of political resistance to me. We've had other prominent politicians say that they would hesitate to take a vaccine that was approved under a Trump administration. So, that attitude creeps into the general public. They become skeptical as well. They figure, well, maybe my governor knows more about these things than I do. There's a natural level of aversion to vaccines as it is in our country. People do have irrational fears about them. And as Dr. Kohl said, a lot of it revolves around, Dr. Gross, revolves around fear of the preservatives in vaccines, or that there's going to be some sort of terrible adverse reaction. And unfortunately, those fears, which are not based in reality, are also coloring people's responses. I don't want to see mandates for vaccines that certainly couldn't be pursued from a federal level. It'd be questionable if it could be from a state level, but it would be far better for the broadest voluntary acceptance to be achieved. And I hope it will be. I hope rational voices will prevail and will persuade.
And Dr. Gross, what are your thoughts on this question regarding the vaccine debate a little bit? And also, I think that there are two different types of concerns in my mind, Dr. Gross, in terms of this particular vaccine. You have some who are just they're anti-vaccination. They look at things and say, oh, these kinds of consequences can come from, the autism point that was raised before and what have you. And I absolutely vaccinate your children, get these vaccines, very important to do. But then you have the other concern that's like, well, it seems like it's brand new. It's coming out to market. Usually these kinds of things can take years. Mumps took 4 years. I mean, it's a long time ago, but still took 4 years. And so there could be a little bit of hesitancy there. But I think also maybe there's a third piece here, which is that there's a lot of skepticism right now about the scientists and the things that we were told early on about COVID-19, this virus, and how it manifests itself, and wear a mask or not wear a mask. That changed over time and so forth. So there's a lot of skepticism of people when it comes to the authority figures of the scientists, the doctors, and especially the government telling us, hey, you should do this sort of thing.
Right. So if we have 30% of the United States to say, I'm going to take a vaccine, so let's just assume 30% of the country is going to be immune to this, we probably need to get to somewhere around 80% of people to have antibodies to get to that herd immunity point where we need to stop this pandemic. So if as a country, we don't have the stomach to have 200,000 people die when we're right at about 10% at the moment, there's no way on earth we could get from 30 to 80%. I mean, we're talking about millions of deaths if we do not undergo this vaccine campaign and overcome this fear of this. This vaccine is going to be safe. It's going to be delivered. The infrastructure that's been put in place through Operation Warp Speed, I think, is spectacular, and I think the scientists and the medical community deserve credit for doing the unthinkable, which is getting a vaccine, the fastest in the history of vaccine development in the history of our world.
Yeah, I think that is very well put, Dr. Lee Gross, and very important food for thought as well. Now I've got you on the three-way screen. I was doing that, finagling it a little bit here. If we could just have you slide over just a smidge to your right, Dr. Gross. Dr. Nan Hayworth, let me ask you just sort of big picture in terms of the public policy handling of this and that trust question that I was just talking about a moment ago in terms of Americans who are just not sure who to believe and who to trust. And I think this does go to a lot of the concerns that we're seeing right now vis-a-vis vaccine and some of the other things going on.
I think, Jimmy, I think knowledge is power. I think there's going to have to be a very conscientious program of explaining what this vaccine is. It's a new type of vaccine for us. It's called an mRNA vaccine. And Dr. Kohl is exactly right. We have built tremendously on the advances of recent years and on the work that was done so intensely on the Ebola virus. But basically, when you get a viral infection, the virus itself takes over some of your cells and makes them into little factories to make more of the virus. And your body recognizes that the virus isn't part of what's supposed to be there, and that's how you generate a great big immune response, but you get sick. The immune response is really what makes you sick. It's everything your body's doing to battle that virus. So it's better to be able to send just a little bit of the instructions instead of your body having to make entire viruses. With an mRNA virus, we're able to send just one of the recipes out of the 1,000 recipes that ordinarily they'd ask your cells to make. We send one recipe to your cells, and they start making that one thing, which happens to be the spike protein. And that's a very recognizable piece of that virus. So if you have an immune response to the spike protein, you won't get sick while your body's generating that immune response to the vaccine. You may feel a little bit off. Some people have for a day or so. But if the virus should attack your cells, it'll be recognized right away. And so I think part of it is explaining, I hear people say, oh my gosh, an mRNA vaccine is going to change my DNA in my cells. And to explain to people, no, not at all. None of that's going to happen. When you have a virus, a viral infection, actually it does take over some of your cells. The viruses actually do that. We're not doing that with a vaccine. We're just helping your body to generate an immune response so that you can go on with your life and and everything's good. But I think, some of those things really have to be explained rationally in a friendly way that consumers can understand. And I think, everybody has to get on board. Our public leaders have to get on board, and I hope they will.
Let's get to a couple of bottom line takeaways as we wrap up with you both. Our remaining guests, Dr. Nan Hayworth, former Congresswoman, and Dr. Lee Gross, owner of Epiphany Health and president of Docs for Patient Care Foundation. And Dr. Gross, going back to the point before about the trends that we have been seeing of late. I mean, we have seen the increase in positive cases that has been absolutely noticeable. In some areas, you've seen an increase in hospitalizations due to COVID-19, but even then, it seems like that's largely manageable, and then the mortality rate is on the decline. But also at the same time, a lot of people who are getting the positive cases, they don't have to go get hospital attention. They're better able to handle it with zinc, for example, and vitamin D and getting rest and so forth, as has basically been the circumstance for my family. So I'm curious your thoughts on what has driven this sort of trend downward at the same time in terms of mortality rate and help to control the hospitalizations, even as we do see such a rise in positivity cases. And where do you think we go from here, Dr. Gross?
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's a combination of many things. Again, it's a younger population that's getting infected this time. We're kind of locking down the elderly and the vulnerable. Therapeutics are getting better. We're recognizing who needs to be in the hospital because, frankly, the hospital is not the place you want to be. Bad stuff can sometimes happen in hospitals, so we want to keep you out of the hospital. But I think an important thing to note is that as we're looking at the cases rise around the country, there is a seasonal variation. Everybody across the country in respiratory illnesses. Everyone knows there's a cold and flu season. We are in the uptick of what would normally be a cold and flu season. And so as we are testing everyone with a respiratory illness for COVID, of course, we're identifying more cases. And I will tell you that if you look at any hospital in any city across the country this time of year, hospital admissions are always rising this time of year. That's what happens in cold and flu season. Intensive care unit beds are almost always operating at capacity. Just like an airplane is designed to fly full, ICU beds are staffed to be at full capacity. They're built to be at full capacity. So it's normal this time of year for ICUs to be full and for hospitals to go on diversion. But in that time when this country shut down, we created backup plans to handle that situation. So even though an ICU may be full on paper, there's overflow units available. There are contingency plans that have put into place. And so that does not mean that people are turned away on the streets. And I have a lot of confidence in the hospitals to handle what's coming our way. I don't think we as a nation have the stomach to do shutdowns. I do think as a community we can make smart decisions and all be kind to each other and considerate to one another and the needs for our neighbors.
Yeah, I think that's so well put, Dr. Gross, and especially in terms of coming together as a community and addressing these things through personal responsibility as opposed to simply having massive mandates. And Dr. Nan Hayworth, to wrap up, I'm wondering from a public policy standpoint, what lessons you think we might have learned about the role of government? For example, as I see parents who are going online on Facebook and other social media platforms, absolutely devastated about their children being forced back into remote learning because they just know that is absolutely woefully inadequate for their kids, especially elementary kids, to get even a half-decent education. No knock on the teachers. It's the nature of the beast, especially when a friend of mine is telling me she's got herself and her husband, and next week they will have 3 kids, and all 5 of them will be on Zoom at the same time, and that is not an easy thing that they're looking forward to at all. So I think school choice provides more opportunities, or there's opportunities for educational choice discussions now. I'm also noticing in terms of the whole idea of better deregulation, especially on medical care and those kinds of things. So what do you make of some of the lessons that we can be learning from a public policy standpoint? Maybe that's not COVID related, but could be very valuable ones for the American people.
Well, Dr. Gross, of course, is one of the pioneers of the patient-centered rather than government-centered healthcare approach. And I agree with you, Jimmy. I think one thing that this pandemic has brought home to us is that it's very, very important for government not to have a heavy hand but to have a helping hand and to allow more latitude and put more trust in the American people to use their common sense to approach some of these very profound phenomena. When you talk about school choice, you're absolutely right. Parents have been at their wits' end. And unfortunately, some folks yell science all the time, but the science says that children should be in in-person school. And there has been a substantial political opposition to doing that. And it has unfortunately become a politicized issue on the government-run school side. So that does become a powerful way that people can recognize that, parents and families should be allowed to use their dollars to choose the schools that work best for their kids. So I think you will see a lot of movement around that whole idea going forward. And in terms of healthcare, the Trump administration actually embraced some great innovations that increase consumer choice, including allowing Medicare to reimburse for telemedicine and telehealth, which was an enormous advance for consumer choice and convenience and safety in this pandemic. So that's been one of the ways in which innovative thinking and allowing folks to work with their doctors for what's best rather than government dictating to them what's best has actually saved lives, I'm sure, in this pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I am now saying, as you know, Dr. Nan Hayworth, I'm very attuned to how we need to message to and win over millennials. And I think there are a heck of a lot of millennials out there who are young parents and parents of young children who will be very open now to and receptive to the argument behind educational choice. So, Dr. Gross, I would be remiss if I didn't take the final minute here to throw it to you to explain how you think that this COVID-19 pandemic has really underscored the need to put patients in charge of their healthcare and really provide more patient-centered care.
Yeah, absolutely. So, about 50% of primary care practices are on the verge of insolvency based upon the heavy hand of the shutdowns. When you shut off fee-for-service visits to primary care practices, and you have patients that are now afraid to come into the office, if your only way of generating revenue for your practice is to actually physically see the patient in your office, you've cut off the revenue stream for the practice. Through our direct primary care model, we are an insurance-free practice. It's a subscription-based practice, much like Netflix. We shifted our practice online on day number one. We did not need to wait for Medicare to create a billing code. We did not need to wait for an insurance company to hold a board meeting to approve telemedicine visits. We did not need to wait for an act of Congress. Forgive me, Congresswoman.
I'm with you.
But we were able to be nimble and actually to react to the needs on the ground, to the needs of our individual patients at that moment. So when we have our vulnerable elderly populations, I do house calls. When we have to do COVID testing, we do it in the parking lot. So we are a very nimble operation because we are no longer under the heavy hand of government. And we no longer insert barriers between the doctors and the patients.
I am thinking, because I was able to see off screen the expression on Dr. Hayworth's face when you were mentioning her in Congress. I would think that she loves the idea of innovation, don't you, Dr. Hayworth, without having government need to get out of the way or get in the way.
Absolutely. The federal government was never designed to manage what we citizens can do within our states, our communities, and our own individual lives. And Dr. Gross's experience and the quality of care that he delivers to his patients at an affordable cost is an example of how the nation can proceed in a very productive and indeed health-enhancing and wellness-enhancing way. And I'd like to see a lot more of that.
And we need to get the move on greater innovations, more innovations. And the best way to do that, get government out of the way. Let that be our final note here with both of you this program. I really appreciate the time. Dr. Nan Hayworth, Dr. Lee Gross, and also Dr. Lewis Kohl, who had to leave earlier. Thank you all so much for joining us. I really appreciate the opportunity to get your insights today. Such a great conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. Once again, Dr. Nan Hayworth, former Congresswoman, Dr. Lee Gross with Epiphany Health and Docs for Patient Care. He's in Florida, and Dr. Lewis Kohl, all joining us. He's with CareMount Medical in New York. And it's always great to get real insights from doctors who know what they're talking about. And let me just say the bottom line as we go today, especially having gotten through COVID-19 myself, although I still have a little bit of congestion that's going on. These things tend to linger for me. And my family's experience of friends that I have. I do know more people, as I said before, who have been dealing with COVID-19, who've contracted the virus in the past few weeks than I knew for months before. But only one person, thank God, has gotten hospitalized. And I think this goes to show that there's one point that a lot more younger people and healthier people are contracting the virus. We're also noticing that hospitals are much more capable of handling the influx of patients than they were in the past, much better treatments. Now there's great encouragement coming up from the vaccines. I may reconsider let me wait several months until I get the COVID vaccine policy. I may go ahead in several months and go ahead and do it. But also there's the point that the mortality rate is going down, as we have seen, despite positive cases rising noticeably. And that is critical in terms of these government policies that are setting behind young children who are 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids getting their first opportunities for a meaningful education, and they're forced into Zoom calls even more now. Parents who are at their wits' end trying to figure out how to deal with their children's education, as well as being able to put food on the table, handle their jobs, go to work if they have to, or find the bandwidth in the internet for all the Zoom calls, all the mental health consequences that have come about because of these lockdowns. We can handle it better. We are handling it better. People are being responsible. Everybody I know, once they test positive, at a minimum, if not sooner, once they test positive for COVID-19, or they go and they get their test, is quarantining and taking personal responsibility for themselves. Let's lean on individuals to do their part and not look to the government to micromanage our lives. No more lockdowns. Let's be sensible. Let's be responsible. And let's unleash the unlimited potential of each and every individual in all walks of life of this country. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. That is it for us today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Again, my thanks to all of our guests, Drs. Hayworth, Kohl, and Gross, and of course to the Washington Examiner, our partners here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. If you liked the video, found it informative, please do like it, click that like button, and share it all over the place. We appreciate your support, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow our partners at the Examiner as well. That is it for us today. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great rest of the day. And as always, may God bless America.